Mr. Trump goes to Moscow. So this is a real thing. Yes, it really happened in the summer of 1987. Donald Trump went to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, to explore the possibility of building a Trump Tower Moscow. So interesting story came out in Russian newspapers right after Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, about 9 hours after Hillary conceded the election. And the story was in one of the propaganda newspapers in Russia. And it was the story of Natalia Dubinina. So Donald Trump was invited by the Soviet ambassador, Yuri Dubinin. So that was her father. And he's the one that made the invitation. So, and this is the story that they wrote in the Russian newspaper about how this whole thing happened. So Natalia Dubinina is telling the story. And she is basically saying how her father was flying in to take over for the previous ambassador. And so normally she would have to be sent home, supposedly, because the same family couldn't be working in the same country, wasn't allowed. But her flight was somehow delayed, and she couldn't get a flight till the next day, so she actually got to meet her father, and they got to go, and she got to show him the city. And the first thing that the guy sees is Trump Tower, and he's drawn to it to such an extent that he has to meet the owner of the building. So they go in and they get a meeting with Donald Trump, and Trump is just so charmed by this guy, Yuri Dubinin. He's such a smooth talker, and he talks about the idea of visiting Moscow and maybe having a Trump Tower in Moscow. So that's basically the story. But as we'll see, there's a few problems with the story, and it's also interesting why the story was printed in the first place at the time it was. So we'll cover that along with a few other things as we go through. All right. So there's a couple problems with the story right off the bat. Number one, Yuri Dubinin barely spoke English the whole time he was in the United States. And even though he got tutoring to improve his English, he still didn't do it. He was basically here. The previous guy that was the ambassador, I'm not going to say his name because it sounds almost like this guy's name. It's going to get confusing. He was recalled by Gorbachev because the guy was a star. That guy could speak English. This guy, they basically put him in to keep his mouth shut and fill the office is basically what his job was. And they sent a guy deliberately who really couldn't communicate that well. So this guy couldn't communicate in English. So that's the first problem. The guy didn't speak English, really. So he wasn't going to charm Trump. The second problem is this whole notion that the daughter and father just went around New York. No. So the father would not have been allowed to just run around New York. Brand new ambassador to the United States. The Soviets were terrified of having their diplomats recruited by the FBI. It had happened in 84 and 85. The Soviets were very strict on their protocols. The daughter is pretty widely understood that she was a KGB agent. So who do you think really had more of an influence on Donald Trump? The old guy who couldn't speak English, the father? Or did the 29-year-old attractive daughter of Yuri Dubinin, did she have an influence? Were there meetings with Donald Trump with her? It's not known. But the story is foolish on its face. There's no way that that's how Trump was broached with the story of going to Moscow. That's not where it happened. So, what was the purpose of this story? That gets interesting. We can cover that later. Despite how the meeting happened, Trump eventually he does run into Yuri Dubinin again, along with another Soviet diplomat at a luncheon given by the cosmetics guy Lauder. So Trump was at a luncheon and was seated next to Yuri Dubinin. I don't know how that happened, and another guy, Vitaly Churkin. And that's where the arrangements were made for the trip to Moscow. Trump goes to Moscow in the summer of 1987. He stays at the Hotel National in the Lenin Suite, which surely would have been bugged in 1987. Not saying anything happened, don't know. And he met with the mayor of Moscow, and he saw sites for a potential Trump Tower Moscow, and nothing really came of it. Although it became a pursuit later on, but nothing really came of it. The sites were not as close to the Kremlin as was communicated to Trump they would be, and the whole idea was really a farce. The idea that at the time in the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, that they were going to build a building next to the Kremlin, which was a symbol of Western capitalism, is absurd. It was never going to happen. The idea was to bring in Trump and charm him, because they did that. The Soviets did that. Not that necessarily that Trump was like this highly prized recruit. No, he was just seen as a person of influence, and he was seen as someone that was potentially susceptible to it. So that's basically what happened. Not much happened, but Trump was brought in, and he probably was given talking points. And the proof of that is that when Trump came back, what happened. So we could talk about that, but basically what the Russians would have done is they would have pumped him up, because during the 80s, it was also Trump visualized himself as this nuclear arms expert, and he was going to negotiate with the Soviet Union and end the Cold War and get nuclear disarmament packages passed, and and all this. And supposedly he said, I can learn everything in 2 weeks. Really, the typical Trump stuff. Well, the Russians would have probably played along with that and played into his ego and pumped out their talking points. And the proof that they did pump out their talking points and did build up his egos happened upon his return to the United States. And so that we'll talk about, because that gets interesting, how all of a sudden Trump puts this information out. So upon Trump's return to the United States, he immediately takes out full-page ads, which cost about $100,000. This is in 1987. In the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, calling for the United States to stop spending money to defend Japan and the Persian Gulf, as only marginal significance to U.S. foreign policy, but one in which Japan and others are totally dependent. So this is kind of weird. So these talking points were actually the kind of talking points which were created by Service A within the Kremlin. And their job was basically to come up with propaganda and taglines which would suit each particular situation. And one of them was Japan, because it was, believe it or not, the Russians had islands in Japan. So that was an area where they were looking to limit U.S. influence. And the one other big area was the Middle East. They were looking to limit U.S. influence in the Middle East. So Trump comes back. They tell him about how they think he has great ideas and how, and then they talk about their ideas and how they think that Trump, he would be a great leader in the United States. You can imagine how this would, come across to Donald Trump. And he visited New Hampshire, and there's this restaurant in New Hampshire that I guess all people go to that are going to run for president. And he gave a speech there, and he was interested in running for president in 1988 against H.W. Bush. But he wound up not doing it because at the time he really wasn't a big enough star at the time. I mean, this is way back in 1987. So, but we know from, and I keep reading from this book, if you notice, it's American Kompromat. The guy who is referenced in the book a lot, the ex-KGB agent, Yuri Shvets, he was in the first chief directorate of the KGB, and he remembers the memos coming around about the great success that the KGB had in getting their talking points into American newspapers. And normally if the asset was highly prized, the name wouldn't appear in the memo, but Trump's name did appear in the memo because basically he wasn't considered a super highly prized asset. He's an asset they're going to pursue, and it turned out to be very successful for them at the time. But at the time, and this kind of goes to show the whole thing, this wasn't some master plan from the beginning that they were going to recruit Donald Trump and get him to be president. But if they have a person of influence and they have the opportunity to make the person more influential, they will. Not that they necessarily thought Donald Trump was going to become president of the United States at the time. So that's not what this is about. This is about them recruiting assets, recruiting influential people wherever they can, appealing to their ego, and getting the results they can out of it. In this case, that alone was a huge success for the KGB. So that is the story of Mr. Trump goes to Moscow. It is not the last time Donald Trump went to Moscow. So the whole point of this story being printed in Russian papers when it was basically sort of a cover story for Russian intelligence. It's basically trying to show that Russian intelligence wasn't involved in the recruitment of Donald Trump, which is obviously, something that Trump's been going way out of his way to try to show. And the other part of the story is it kind of shows Donald Trump by printing that nonsense. They're like, hey, we obviously remember what the real story is. We're not telling anyone, but we know, we remember. So that's sort of the point of the story. It's sort of a cover story and sort of a reminder at the same time.